My name is Lalita Vaidyanathan. I'm a managing director at FSG, and I cannot be more thrilled to be introducing this next session as well as our speaker for the next session, Angela Glover Blackwell. Before I introduce Angela, I want to say three things about this next session. The first is, what is equity? The second is, why are we talking about equity and why are we talking about it here and why are we talking about it now? And the third is the similarities or differences between what equity means in the US versus what it means outside the US in the developed world. So the first, what is equity? So equity in this context, and given that this is a corporate audience, I feel compelled to say this, it is not about stock ownership in a company. It is about what Jim Kim, Jaime Ayala, and the folks on the panel just now talked about. It's about social and economic inclusion. And it's about social and economic inclusion in ways that allows everyone in society to reach their full potential. And so that's the sort of official definition, if you like, of how we're going to think about what equity actually means. And so why are we talking about it? And why are we talking about it here? And why are we talking about it now? So I think we at FSG have been on this journey to really ask the question that if we are in the business of social change, are we doing everything we can to truly understand the needs of the people we serve? Are we truly engaging with the communities that we seek to serve? And are we truly developing solutions that actually serve the needs of the people we seek to serve? And I think the conclusion we've come to is that we're doing a lot of those things, but there are many other things that we need to do and do better in order for us to be successful at our endeavor at creating social change. And we feel that's a very important discussion for us to have in the shared value community, because that is essentially what all of us here are trying to do, is create social impact through capitalism. Now, the last thing I want to say is how equity is different in the US. It is similar, but it is different in the US and outside the US. In the US, equity or disparities or inequity tends to affect people from particular communities, typically low income, people of color. Your immigration status in the US tends to determine whether or not you have access to the opportunities that the rest of us might have. How it's different in other parts of the world is that the kinds of things that you look for that actually determine who has access to opportunities may be different. So India is the other place in which I do a lot of my work, and there caste matters, right? It also matters what your socioeconomic status is. It matters what your gender is in more ways than it matters here in the US. And again, you can take any different part of the world, and the kinds of things that define equity or inequity is different, could be different in different parts of the world, and there are similarities. And so I'd like us to just sort of keep that in mind, because what Angela is going to talk about is going to be largely with a lens on how inequities manifest here in the US. But I just want to say that it's true everywhere in the world. It just looks different. So with that, let me introduce our speaker, Angela Glover Blackwell. Angela is the founder and president of PolicyLink. Quick word on PolicyLink. PolicyLink is a research and action institute that develops and implements policy that advances social and economic equity for all. One great example that I love of the work that they've done in the last 7 years is the advancing of the Healthy Food Initiative. And that it's a federal policy that has delivered over $1 billion to create access to healthy food in low-income communities and communities of color around the country. Angela started her career as a public interest lawyer, and she was a senior executive at the Rockefeller Foundation. She currently sits on several very influential boards, including the Levi Strauss Corporation, the James Irvine Foundation, and very fortunately for us, on the FSG board. Angela and PolicyLink have been a very critical partner for FSG in our journey to integrate equity more into our work, whether it's in collective impact or in shared value, and we have learned much from them. I'd say Angela is a visionary, but she's also very practical and very solutions-oriented. And on a personal note, I think she's a wonderful human being who embodies many of the values that she works hard to advance in society. So I could not be more thrilled to invite up to stage Angela Blackwell and invite you in joining me in giving her a warm welcome. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon. It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure to be here, and I mean that in so many ways. One, it's wonderful to be introduced as a wonderful human being. My parents, my parents will love that. But I am also just so excited to be in a place where we're talking about how to reimagine capitalism. In a place where we're talking about how to move along the continuum of doing the right thing because it is the right thing, to doing the right thing because it is the right thing and it's also the profitable thing to do. I think that's an amazing development. And I want to talk to you about a problem and an asset. The problem that I want to talk about is inequality. The asset that I want to talk about is our shifting demographics. Inequality really has become a problem. Economists didn't used to think that it was, but economists have certainly concluded in recent years that inequality is a problem, particularly when it comes to growth. The International Monetary Fund has done a study of 100 countries and found that for every 10% decrease in inequality, there was a 50% lengthening in the period of growth. Colleagues of mine have done a similar study in the United States, Manuel Pastor and Chris Benner, and found the same thing, looking at 100 different regions. For every 10% decrease in inequality, there was a 50% lengthening in the period of growth. It's not inequality per se that is the problem. It's toxic inequality. That we've gotten to a point where inequality has become toxic. It's hollowing out the middle class, it's deepening poverty, and it has stalled economic mobility. That is a problem. In the United States, it is a problem that is beginning to define every aspect of how we live and how we work. I want to talk about the next thing, which is really an amazing asset, and that's shifting demographics. It's not a realized asset because we haven't realized that it's an asset, but the shifting demographics have the potential to really transform the way everything happens, transform the future. We live in a nation in the United States in which people of color are rapidly becoming the majority. We know the date. By 2044, the majority of all people who live in the United States will be of color: Native American, Asian, Latino, African American, and other. What's not as well known is that since the summer of 2012, the majority of all babies born in this country are of color. All those under 5 years old are of color. By the end of this decade, 2019, the majority of all children in the United States 18 and under will be of color. By 2030, the majority of the young workforce will be of color. And so when we say the majority of people will be of color by 2044, that actually is an understatement because the demographic shift to become a nation of people of color isn't the only demographic shift that is taking place. The white people who live in the United States are becoming older, and the people of color are young. The median age for people who are white is 42. The median age for the fastest growing group of people of color, Latino, is 27. And so when you really think about how many people are older and how many people are younger, that we're going to become majority people of color being of reproductive years, of working years, of entrepreneurial years, of civic engagement years, that's going to happen in a big way very soon. It's an extraordinary asset. It's an extraordinary asset because when you think about what that really means, it means that the people who are still in the buying home age are vast. That the people who are still thinking about starting businesses are vast. That the people who really have skin in the game of a public education system that works, people who have skin in the game of communities that are safe and vibrant and wonderful places to bring up children, that's who we have in this country. And yet, the sad news is that we're leaving the very people who are going to be the future behind. We're leaving them behind disproportionately, and we're leaving them behind in ways that are starting to feel baked in. When we think about poverty in this country, it doesn't really make sense to focus on poverty much anymore, just as those people who are living at the very bottom, coming up with responses of making sure people have access to food, making sure people have access to enough money to be able to live with dignity. When you have a huge swath of your population that is at risk of being left behind, you've got to figure out ways to allow them to be able to move into the middle class. that when we think about it, I like to frame it as not just looking at people who live below the poverty level, but people who live 200% of the poverty level and below. Because that's the reality. People don't just move below the poverty level and stay there. They move in and out. They move in and out. Think about that group that's 200%. That's 100 million people in the United States. 100 million people. It's a third of the population. 53% of people who are Latino and African American live in that area, that 200%. They're in that 100 million. The majority of people who are there are people of color. So that as we think about the future, we have to really see that the very people who are being left behind are the people that we're going to be dependent on to be the middle class. I say America can see its future, and it's a 5-year-old Latina. It's a 7-year-old black boy. It's a 12-year-old Hmong youngster. What happens to them will determine the fate of the nation. We know who they are, we know where they live, we know what they need, and we know what we need to do. We need to build equity. We need to pursue equity. We need to make sure that all can participate, prosper, and reach their full potential. It'll be good for them, but it'll be good for everybody if that happens. And so I want to talk to you about equity and shared value, because I think that equity really accelerates the movement from corporate social responsibility to shared value. Take the issue that Lalitha just lifted up about food. That if you think about food and think about all the communities where people don't have access to food, particularly in the United States, if you're thinking about your corporate social responsibility, the response might be to invest in a food bank. It might be to allow your employees to volunteer at a soup kitchen. It might be to do something to be able to make sure that young children have access to a decent meal during lunchtime at school. But if you really want to address that problem, thinking about the fact that people don't have access to food, part of it has to do with poverty, but part of it has to do with the way that we have treated poor people, particularly poor people of color. This notion of not having access to healthy food isn't just a poverty problem, it's a problem of food deserts. You must have heard that term. Communities all across this country that don't have access to fresh fruits and vegetables because they are not served by grocery stores. It's something that I saw personally growing up. I grew up in a community when I was a child. It was a vibrant middle-class black community. Over time, because of disinvestment, many things began to leave that community, including grocery stores. So by the time I was going home from college or going home as a young mother to visit with my family, I noticed my parents were driving into far areas, into the suburbs, just to find a grocery store. That issue is repeated all across America. So you have so many communities that are black and Latino with no access to grocery stores. Now, a food bank might help a little bit, but what people need is economic activity in that community. They need a grocery store. And figuring out how to make a grocery store work is becoming very active business activity in this country because people have started to focus on it. Problem still hasn't been solved. The grocery stores that are coming into the areas tend to operate at the margin of the communities because they still want to get as close as possible to what are more upper income communities. So we still have a problem. We need to figure out how to get deeper in the community. We need to learn how to deliver meals. We need to figure out how people can access food in ways that they can preserve it so that they can have what they need when they need it. There are a lot of activities there. So when you think about this issue of looking at the need and thinking about the responsibility, we have a big challenge. That the equity challenge is multiple. And businesses can not only make money, but they can create a market that they will continue to make money. Let me talk it through. When we think about equity and inclusion, one of the first things we think about is hiring. We ought to hire more people of color. We ought to give more people of color jobs. Everybody knows that a diverse workforce is a good thing. We don't have to make that case anymore, though we still have to do it. But we don't have to make the case. But the next thing is we understand that we ought to have diversity in the boardroom. We know that bringing in different voices, more diverse voices around governance can make a difference. But after we've hired, after we've got more people in the boardroom, we also need to make sure that our business practices are expanding equity, because we need to make sure that we're investing in small businesses of color, small businesses led by women of color, small businesses led by men of color, because people of color are more likely to hire people of color. And if we want to create pathways into the middle class, we want to use every strategy that we can to be able to both build businesses, but also build businesses that will help to build salaries, to build income, to build consumers, to build a base. We need to make sure that when we hire people, we're paying people wages that allow them to be able to buy the products that you're going to sell and that you're going to make. This has been understood in the past, but we've lost touch with that. But it's more than that. We need to also make sure that our procurement processes are really thinking about who are we reaching out to, where are we creating opportunities. And then we need to make sure that our products and services are really responsive. I talked about grocery stores, but we could talk about many things. One of the things that we should have learned during the era of really thinking about corporate social responsibility is how important it is to talk to the communities that you're concerned about, how important it is to build authentic partnerships and relationships. That not only helps you to be able to know where to invest, but it helps you to know how to invest. Building those relationships is absolutely key, so that when we think about how to be able to have the services and the products that are needed, you have to have a relationship. Communities have to be co-developers of these strategies, because the more that you understand about community, the more you're going to be able to tap those things that are really needed, and the more community will understand its relationship and understand who you are. So the products and the services is key, but the process of being able to get there is also important. And there's another issue. Businesses have also understood, always understood, that they have a voice in the public policy arena. When the public policy impacts the business directly, it's easy to speak out. But we have a public policy need to make sure that our policies are helping to create these pathways to the middle class. So when there is an opportunity to speak out about the need for early childhood programs, when there's a need to speak out about making sure that people who are formerly incarcerated have access to opportunity, when there's a need to speak out on issues like affordable housing, so the people who are trying to access the middle class can stay in communities like Oakland that are starting to do better. There are two stories to read about Oakland, California. One is that business and restaurants and entertainment are coming to Oakland, and the other is that low-income people, particularly people who are Black, are getting pushed out of Oakland. If we have an opportunity to speak out about housing, that is important too. So this is what I think. I think that we're at a point where the equity agenda, while it will always be a moral imperative, has become an economic imperative. It's become a national imperative. If the people who are going to be the future do not have access to all of the resources they need to be full participants, and that includes economic participants, the story of the future is not a happy one. That we need to understand that equity is the superior growth model for the nation. We actually have tried to look at that from a data point of view at PolicyLink. And what we did was we looked at what would happen if we closed the income, the racial income gap between people of color and white people in the United States. And what we found is that the GDP would increase by $2.1 trillion. $2.1 trillion. This is the perfect storm in terms of being able to add every element to this conversation about shared value. So we are really finding all of the ways that we have a shared interest. I believe that this conversation is probably one of the most important taking place. When I listen to the dialogue about government responsibility and the responsibility of the not-for-profit sector, there is no question that when you get to a point like this one, where we need all hands on deck, where there is so much at stake, it is only by being in full partnership with the private sector that our aspirations for the nation can be realized. And it's only by realizing our aspirations for the nation that we can really have a business sector that can thrive. Thank you.